Hello YouTube. Thank you for our 4,500 plus subscribers. We definitely appreciate you guys. Here's our router crafter from Sears. We're going to be going over the main things here on this router crafter. This is model number 720.25250. It's a pretty simple machine. It's just like a router lathe. Here's the router on top of the router carriage. So let's go over the basics. First off, we got the headstock. That's going to contain this piece right here. It's made out of cast aluminum. So that's going to contain the cable drum and the cable, of course, and then the drive spindle can move freely if you lift up the index pin here. If you put back the index pin, it's going to be held in position so that you can crank the machine with the crank here when you're doing cuts. Once again, here is the headstock, and the headstock also is where you put the crank handle, and the crank handle is how you turn the machine so that you can go from one side to the other, from left to right. From here to here is about 7.5 inches. From here to here is about 4.5 inches. And then from top to bottom is also about 4.5 inches. And then we're about 1 inch deep here. And then we got the frame tubes. The frame tubes, there's 3 frame tubes. 1, 2, 3, and then there's a guide tube where the router carriage, this is the router carriage, where the router carriage slides along. So 3 frame tubes and 1 guide tube. The frame tubes and the guide tube are about 1 inch in diameter, and they're made out of steel, galvanized steel, these particular ones. Then on each end there's going to be the pulleys. These are 2-inch Delrin pulleys. Well, these pulleys aren't difficult to make if you needed to out of wood. On each end there's 2 inchers right over here, and then on top here there's a 1 incher. A bicycle cable would be fine for brakes, that would work here. This one's a vinyl coated cable, or a vinyl coated metal cable. Those little pad feet can be adjusted here to set the depth where you need to be. That rests on this frame tube. Whenever you're making cuts, you always want to go from left to right. When it's off, when the router is off, yes. But whenever you're making cuts and the machine is on, slow and steady and only left to right. This is like a custom little headstock, a secondary headstock, if you will. Here you can screw a 1/2 inch dead center or a live center. One of the problems with the Sears Craftsman router crafter is this drive spindle is made to hold primarily square stock. This can be taken out no problem from the drive spindle here. That way we can use this for square stock, like I was saying, or this chuck with a dead center can be put on no problem, so that, like I was saying, you can hold circular or round stock no problem, especially smaller stuff here. And this is awesome because it makes this router crafter a lot more versatile, since you're only going to hold square stock inside this spindle for the most part. Onto the frame tubes, and it's just made out of a piece of a 2x4 and some square stock turned down on a lathe and threaded. I like to call it a headstock extension because this is the headstock right here. Inside the headstock is the cable drum, the drive spindle. This is a piece of wood with a piece of flat stock at the bottom. So once you loosen these screws,
you can take out that piece of flat stock right over here, swing it around and out of the way. Here it just needs to be loosened, not all the way, here all the way, so that we can swing this piece of flat stock out of the way. Once you do that, you loosen that up and she'll come right out. Just make sure you have your workpiece out of the way. It'll slide easily in. You can see this little screw, that little screw tightens up. It spreads because there's little cuts here on each side of this piece of, I believe that's 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch. There needs to be room for this crank handle so it can't go all the way through. Take off your accessory. You see how this moves freely now? There's a little small washer. Now this can come out of that section. Now once you loosen it, it should come out no problem from this angle, from this end. Then it's just this little cool piece here made out of a piece of 2x4. Some cuts in it, some holes in it, and a piece of flat stock that clamps onto the frame tubes once it's in position there. Then you add, it's gone in not all the way, but just enough to where you have a little bit of room for the crank handle to come inside. Don't forget to get creative. Get some spade bits. Get a set of spade bits from 1/8 all the way up to 1 inch. 10, 12 bits, whatever it may be. And most people in their workshop have a grinder. Just grind down your work bits to look like oggies, Roman oggies, or any modification you want. And you can get a custom cut that you normally wouldn't find in a set like this. Getting a set like this is great. You don't need a bearing most of the time when you're working here on a router, on the router crafter. If you're doing trim work, of course, but these spade bits are really inexpensive for the most part. You can get them in a set for like less than 20 bucks, and most people have grinders. Grinders are less than 100 bucks, and you literally can make dozens and dozens of these modified bits yourself with a little bit of creativity. Just look online how to do it. There's a certain way to grind the bit. You'll see by the way the edges are ground out already, that's what you pretty much need to keep. There's just a few other modifications, like on this one, the top was trimmed off, obviously. It can be done. A little bit of creativity and elbow grease. You can see right here on this end, you can offset by loosening the screw and offset it a few degrees depending on what you need to do. So that's another good feature about the router crafter. When you're making something like offset legs, you're going to want to offset. This side is going to be centered, and this side will be offset if you're going to make some sort of offset work. This could be cast out of aluminum cans if you're, good at that. But the easiest, quickest way is just make this out of wood. You can make this piece out of clamping to the tube.
and then there's a little set screw there to hold it in place. This wing nut here is to adjust your drive screw. So that screw, like I said, is acting like a quill and a dead center. Ideally, you're going to have this about 3 inches, 3.5 inches away from the tailstock. You want to make sure that you're always square. You don't want to be off center. You want to be nice and square here. So before you're doing any cutting, obviously, you're squaring your workpiece, you're squaring your tailstock up. This is 1/2 inch, I believe 13 TPI thread, so it's easy to find stuff and make your own stuff for this too. You can make a longer one, a shorter one. You want to make sure that you always set your stops. Here's the stop at the tailstock end. So if your piece is going to be square, let's say here, and you're doing your turned section here with some spirals, obviously you want the lathe or the router to stop there. And another hose clamp over here at the headstock end. So there's where your stops are. You always want to set those. We got the router base or the carriage, just like on a lathe, you have a carriage. This can be made out of, easily made out of a nice hard piece of oak or pine or ash. You can make it out of wood, no problem. The main thing is it's going to be mounted. Here I just have it mounted temporarily with a seat clamp. And some circumstances you want it to move, but most of the time you want it to stay still here. And then, like I said before, these are your little feet adjustment screws that get adjusted with these wing nuts here. Inside here, there's little small plastic cartridges or bearings basically, and those bearings, there's 2 of them, one on each side. Those bearings are really important. They're called nyliner bearings. What are nyliner bearings? Well, there's a company that makes nyliner bearings called Simpson Nyliner, and they look something like so. It doesn't have to be a nyliner bearing, just figure out some sort of bearings there, because it's got to slide along the tube nice and smoothly. And you're going to pretty much just use wax here. There's no need to lube anything up. Keep it clean and use wax. A template follower that's connected to the carriage, the router carriage. This is what you're using when you're making a template. Here's our little basic template that we made, and it's just C-clamp to the side, of course. When we're coming along here, we can come up to the template very slowly and surely, and then it can just slowly glide up and down, and once your cut is done, then you can bring her up. We made something like this with a template similar to that. Now let's put our router on the router carriage. You definitely want to take this plastic base off of the router when you're putting it on the router carriage. So let's take this off first. Surprise, a bunch of sawdust. You're not going to be able to use the same screw, but the same thread, just a little bit longer with the washer, because here you need a washer. Thanks to the slots are quite wide. So a little bit longer number 1032 screw and with the washer, and then center it up, and you should be around here or so. Get a block of wood, face the router. It's going to be facing forward, and you can put the router on that block of wood so that you can hold it, help you hold it in place while you get the router screwed in from this position right here. Once you find the holes, then you can put the screws in where you need to put them in. Once you have one screw on there, then the other ones are almost lining up for you already. So just get the other two on, leave this one loose before you put it on all the way tight. Make sure you're centered here and you're good. Okay, now the router is connected to the router carriage properly. It's aluminum router base directly onto the cast aluminum router carriage. That's how you properly put on the routers to the router carriage. You can loosen and tighten the router so that when you're making adjustments, it can be done easily and on the fly. It can be tightened up without a tool, basically. So that's really cool. It's just a piece of flat stock welded onto a piece of round stock. There is a small little adapter that JC made so that we can plug in the vacuum. A little bit less cleanup time. JC made this adapter from a piece of flat stock and a piece of pipe basically welded together. So never move the machine or the router back into position in the workpiece. You don't want to mess up your marks or your nice workpiece. Lift her up and then crank it back, remember. If you just got done cutting from left to right and the machine is on, leave it on, move it out of the way of the workpiece, then turn it off. 1.5 horsepower Craftsman we leave on primarily for the router crafter. Then we have this guy. It's also a Craftsman, 1.5 horsepower, but it's a little bit bigger and bulkier. Always attached to the router table. So when we're doing some trim on molding or something like that, it's always ready to go. Then of course the trim routers, designed specifically for trim and very portable, obviously. This little cheapie from HFT, but boy, she works good for being a cheapie. You could put a trim router on this puppy, on a router crafter. You can use a cheap little trim router. I don't recommend it, but if you're just getting started, I recommend getting at least a 1.5 horsepower like these guys. You have a square stock like this, let's say, and you want to make it round, so in each of the 4 corners you're going to have to surface it with the machine. You can do that without having to use the cable. You can disconnect the cable and still use the index points on the router to find those 4 corners. This holds this piece of flat stock with this bolt, and it'll hold the drive spindle in place so that you don't need to use the cable. This is where you tighten her up right here. Now it's locked in place right there so that you can find the points where you need to round out the corners. Trick when you are rounding out corners is start at 3, that's your right hand corner, or start at 21, that's your left hand corner, or vice versa, depending on if you're going left or right, or clockwise or counterclockwise. Your 4 corners are basically 21, 3, 15, and 9. So you just continuously route out those. You're going to probably need more than 1 pass. We usually do that. This wood lathe, a very cheap Taiwanese wood lathe.
That allows us to just do it quicker, and we can have a little bit more of a production line. Once this is locked in place, that's when you're going to move it. For example, if you're making the rounded end corners, you're going to move it from 3 to 9 to 15 to 21. And you're going to have to disengage this every time. But don't forget over here, before you even start, this is where the cable is connected to the router carriage. Let's see if we can do this with just one hand, baby. And once you've disconnected, there's a little lug right there. That's the upper lug. Now it's disconnected. The cable is disconnected from the router carriage. Once you do that, then you can do your facing of material, and you can do other things that you don't necessarily need the cable for. In this case, when you do have the cable disconnected, you can go left to right and right to left, no problem when you're facing, because there's no cable that's going to snag or lag. I already showed you how to disconnect the cable from the carriage here with this 5/32 hex bolt. Well, guess what? There's an upper lug, once you do take it off, that comes out. And there's a lower lug. So on the upper cable, there's an upper lug. On the lower cable, there's a lower lug. You can connect it to both of these, the lower and the upper lug. When you connect it to the upper lug, you're going to have counterclockwise spirals if you connect it to the upper lug. If you connect it to the lower lug, you're going to have clockwise spirals. That's how you change the direction or the rotation of the machine depending on what kind of spiral you want. With the upper lug, you're going to have a left-hand spiral, and with the lower lug, you're going to have a right-hand spiral. Now that we're disconnected from the upper lug, we can go to the lower lug, but don't forget, because we're going to go from the upper to the lower lug. The lower lug is near the spring, so put the lower lug near the router crafter now. And notice the spring is near the tailstock. So after you already have your tailstock centered or squared, then you can perform this procedure. We're using a 1/4-inch drill bit, and we're going to put her inside, and we're going to use this drill bit, since it's nice and long and straight, as a line of sight from the headstock end to the tailstock end, and we're going to line it up with the tip of the tailstock drive screw. Once we do that, we know we're centered. Once again, make sure that your router base is connected directly to the router carriage. No plastic piece in between. You're going to want to loosen these screws up so that the router can move freely, ever so slightly, so that you can position it in the center point here. Once you have the center point here, then you can screw on your C-clamp and tighten up your bolts. Let me show you. You might have to make a few adjustments here so that your drill bit is moved a little bit further right or a little bit further left so that it's lined up nicely here. Lock it in place with the 3 screws. Take off your C-clamp. You don't need that anymore, and you don't want to use that when you're actually using the machine. Get your line of sight so that you can see the drill bit. In this case, you want to see it pretty much lined up perfectly or very closely to the center point of that tailstock drive screw. Center, so you put back the bit you were going to use to do your cuts.
JC's great tips is always start at 24. Don't make it hard on yourself. 24 is acting sort of like a 0 point or a start point as well. So for example, you start on 24 on your first spiral. Let's say you wanted to make 8 spirals. You're going to start at 24, then 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, 21 would be your other index points, so that you can get a total of 8 positions or 8 spirals. Same thing if you wanted 6 spirals, it would be like so: 24, 4, 8, 12, 16, 20. And if you wanted 4 spirals, and then 3 spirals, 2 spirals, 12 spirals. It's a good idea to always set your starting point at 24. Do you have to? Of course not. This is just what we do. This is what I learned from JC. It's a real cool trick and it makes it easy. And have a piece of paper written with your set points written down. Here's some set points that JC already wrote on a piece of board. Inside the manual, once again, on page 9 and 10 is a really cool little section on roping or spiraling, and they also go over what bits are good for what cut. Well, I would definitely suggest get the manual. Even if you don't even have one of these machines, you'll learn something. VintageMachinery.org. This machine, you definitely want to have most of these parts: the frame tubes, and obviously your router carriage, your drive spindle. You definitely want to have a headstock. You want to have a drum, a cable drum. This one on this machine is about 2.5 or 2.25 inches in diameter. This one's made out of Delrin, but it can be made out of wood. Most of these components can be made out of wood. The hard part is finding little small stuff like these little rings. You can use a washer with some sort of threaded nut instead. There's little pins that are holding in the pulleys, and there's a small little retaining rings. So get some retaining rings or use something similar. You're going to need a spring right over here. That's pretty critical. Let us know if you have any questions, because we are willing to answer them. Don't forget to take a look at our website, a1cfs.com.